In the annals of history, kings are usually remembered for the battles they won, the temples they built, or the empires they forged. However, there existed a great ruler in the 3rd millennium BC who achieved long-lasting fame not because of his conquest or influence, but because he enacted the first recorded social reform in history. Approximately 2350 BC, Urukagina ascended to rule over the Sumerian city-state of Lagash and issued a sweeping reform restoring economic justice. He cancelled debts, liberated bondservants, and restored communal property. It is considered the earliest known campaign to redistribute wealth and curb corruption. As noted in his own inscription, Urukagina was picked out of the crowd and appointed ruler by a population desperate to be freed from a predatory creditor class. His name, translated by the Assyriologist Dietz Edzard as the legitimate lawgiver, signified that his authority rested upon social and economic justice. How did Urukagina carry out his reforms, and what did economic justice look like 4,000 years ago? To understand Urukagina's reforms, one must first recognize the crisis he confronted when assuming the throne. The Ur-Nanshi dynasty, which had governed Lagash since about 2500 BC, came to an end around 2365 BC. The Ningirsu temple administration sponsored the temple manager Enantarzi as ruler. Enantarzi was succeeded by his son Lugalanda. During this period, the economic system of Lagash became corrupted. In southern Mesopotamia, temples historically served as both the economic and moral centers of urban life. Temples owned fields, orchards, pasturage, and fisheries. They provided shelter for widows, orphans, and the disabled, setting them to work in specialized handicraft production. They also served as main repositories of society's savings in grains and precious metals. The palace's purpose was to construct and endow these temples. However, during Enantarzi's and Lugalanda's regimes, palace officers didn't support the temples but systematically extracted their wealth. Members of royal families seized public land. Palace officials took temple-owned oxen, asses, grain, and fruits. They squeezed temple workers by cutting rations and demanding that members of every profession, from shepherds to singers, pay a share of their earnings to the palace. Revenues from farming and fishing rights, tithes of shepherds and gardeners, were precisely calculated according to their value, and it was not allocated towards the gods or citizenry, but towards a growing body of administrators, overseers, and courtiers. The bureaucracy had become a parasite, feeding off the surplus from the very institutions meant to sustain its host. For ordinary citizens, the consequences were devastating. Many citizens were forced into debt to self-dealing officials. Fiscal agents collected fees from workers, then lent the money back to those who struggled to pay. Palace officials invaded family gardens, seizing crops and livestock for debts or services. One passage from Urukagina's reform text illustrates how merciless the system was. If a poor man had an interest-accruing loan for his fish tank, his creditor could take away its fish simply by uttering a simple, "O sun god" complaint. There was no judicial oversight involved. Officials could strike citizens who refused to sell their property, and debtors were forced into ever more desperate arrangements. For example, one man had to sell his son to Enantarzi, which was the first recorded instance of a parent selling their child into servitude. The temple and palace, which were originally set up to protect the vulnerable, had become their oppressors. Urukagina's response to this crisis was comprehensive. His reform text, which detailed the abuses perpetrated by his predecessors and proclaimed a restoration of justice, was inscribed on clay cones and plaques for display in public throughout the city. This reform text is the earliest known example of a systemic economic reform, and its provisions touch on nearly every aspect of social life. First, Urukagina reversed the palace's appropriation of temple wealth. He restored the custom of former times, so that temple property and that of the citizenry at large could no longer be taken by palace officials. Royal properties were turned over to the Ningirsu temple administrators, and the Queen's Palace and its fields were reassigned to the Ba'u temple. Similarly, the houses and fields of royal children were returned to the Shulshagana and Igalim temples. By returning communal wealth to temples, Urukagina re-established the sacred foundation of Lagash's social organization. Second, the reform protected individual citizens from the violent expropriation they had suffered under Lugalanda. Officials back then were authorized to seize boats, sheep, fisheries, and even family homes. Urukagina decreed that owners could name their own price for their property, and if buyers were unwilling to meet their price, the sale could not be forced. This was aimed at curbing the arbitrary power of the bureaucracy and promoting contractual freedom. Third, and perhaps most profoundly, Urukagina cancelled debts and freed bondservants. As mentioned before, many citizens under Lugalanda had accumulated debt owing to corrupt officials. Most fiscal agents collecting fees for the palace or temples lent the money back to citizens at interest. When debtors were unable to pay, their property was confiscated, and they sometimes had to sell their children or wives into debt bondage. Urukagina stated in his reform text that he cleared and cancelled obligations for those indentured families. He made a binding oral agreement with the god Ningirsu that he would never subjugate the orphan or widow to the powerful. Previously, women pledged as debt servants had often been forced into sexual servitude to their creditors. Urukagina's reform abolished this practice, declaring that a woman pledged for debt owed no sexual obligations to the creditor. This was essentially what the concept of justice meant in ancient Mesopotamia. As noted by François Thureau d'Anjin, an early translator of this text, justice in Sumerian language meant specifically that officials and wealthy individuals had no legal claim to foreclose on the most vulnerable members of the community, the widows and orphans. Lastly, Urukagina took steps to reduce the living cost for ordinary citizens. Marriage and divorce ceremony fees, which had previously rose to a silver shekel for priest plus 5 shekels for palace, became completely free. Burial fees fell from 7 pitchers of beer and 420 loaves of bread to 3 pitchers and 80 loaves, just enough to feed singers and cult servants. Workshop rations had been cut so severely that temple workers were forced to beg. Urukagina guaranteed that specific amounts of bread, beer, and other food would be provided to guild members and blind laborers. He also increased by nearly 2/3 the number of individuals entitled to receive these rations. In a society where a large portion of labor was organized through temple workshops, this represented a vast expansion of the social safety net. Although Urukagina's reform is the first recorded legal and social reform in human history, the tradition of royal debt cancellation had long existed in ancient Sumer. The earliest known example was the Amargi proclamation of Enmetena, the last ruler of the Ur-Nanshi dynasty, around 2400 BC. The term Amargi means return to the mother condition. It refers to bondservants returning home to their family, which means liberty from debt bondage. Some scholars argue that this is the first written reference to the abstract concept of liberty in history. Enmetena issued his decree after a military victory over the neighboring city-state Umma. However, celebration was not the primary reason for his decree. Many citizens of Lagash were forced into debt servitude due to the economic disruption caused by prolonged conflict. By annulling interest-bearing grain loans and restoring family members to one another, Enmetena sought to restore the social order and make sure that citizens once liberated could again serve as soldiers and producers. Enmetena's Amargi proclamation set a precedent for future kings, who would also periodically declare debt amnesties, construct temples and other civic projects as a means of demonstrating their ability to provide for the well-being of their subjects. As such, it became a standard image in Mesopotamian art for kings to be depicted with a measuring rod and a coiled surveying rope in hand, which means they are builders and administrators first and foremost. After Enmetena and Urukagina, future Mesopotamian rulers continued to declare debt amnesties. Around 2150 BC, Gudea of Lagash commemorated his rebuilding of the Gatumdu temple with a festival at which he decreed debt cancellation. Gudea used the Sumerian terms Niksisa, which means justice. The Neo-Sumerian ruler Ur-Nammu, who found the third dynasty of Ur after defeating Lagash, issued a Niksisa Act cancelling debts circa 2100 BC. His son, Shulgi, did likewise. The Babylonian king Hammurabi, famous for writing one of the earliest legal codes in human history, declared Masharam debt cancellations in the year of his accession, and again in 1780, 1771, and 1762 BC, after defeating the city-state of Larsa. Apart from military victory, debt cancellations also occurred in conjunction with New Year festivals. This periodical reordering of social balance acknowledged the cyclical nature of debt accumulation. If we want to understand why debt cancellation was such a regular occurrence throughout ancient Mesopotamia, we need to look at the economic foundation of their society. Lagash and subsequent Babylonian rulers did not forgive debts out of pure altruism. Rather, they did so because the alternative would be the collapse of the state's military and economic capacity. Between 2800 and 2300 BC, southern Mesopotamia experienced rapid urbanization. People gathered in walled cities to obtain access to canal systems and to take refuge from widespread warfare and nomadic raids. Irrigation was the key to Sumer's soil fertility and hence its population support capacity. Settlements without year-long access to water dwindled rapidly. Falling water levels along the Euphrates River required a constant labor force to develop and maintain canals. Meanwhile, conflicts over water often broke out between upstream and downstream cities. In this context, a sufficient number of free peasants able to serve in the military and to provide corvée labor for canal construction was absolutely essential for the survival of any city-states. Furthermore, southern Mesopotamia lacked metal, stone, and hardwood. These materials had to be imported from faraway lands. Copper and tin were acquired from Anatolia and the Iranian plateau, and timber from the Taurus Mountains and Dilmun. To trade for these resources, temples organized a labor force producing textiles, grain, and handicrafts for export. Temples provided shelter for widows, orphans, and the infirm, and set them to work grinding flour, producing textiles, and other handicrafts with the specialization of labor far above the family scale. This was essentially a workfare program in modern terms. Additionally, temples were the main repositories of society's savings. They stored the surplus grain and precious metals. Silver and gold offerings were cast into sacred objects that could be melted down and minted in emergencies to purchase food or hire mercenaries. Now, we have established the major conditions for the survival of a Mesopotamian city-state. There must be a large population of free peasants able to serve in the army and provide corvée labor, as well as a temple workforce that produced export goods. To meet these requirements, land ownership must be secured. Citizens received land from their communities in exchange for providing corvée labor and military service. For instance, Ilku land in Babylonia belonged to the crown and could not be transferred. However, creditors could exploit loopholes in the system, using debt as a lever to obtain communal land. The easiest opportunity came after the debtor's death. Creditors got themselves adopted as the debtor's number one son, or arrange marriages between their daughters and debtors' sons. They could thus obtain debtors' landholdings through inheritance. By appropriating communally allocated landholdings, creditors undermined the ruler's fiscal base. Once communal land was privatized, the social labor attached to that land could no longer serve public duties. Debtors became their creditors' bondservants. They could no longer provide military service or corvée labor. Thus, the army's strength declined, canal maintenance was neglected, and temples had no food to feed their workers. Consequently, the ruler's power and the very survival of their society were threatened. Now, we can understand that the periodical declarations of debt amnesties in ancient Mesopotamia were acts of self-preservation. Coronations, wars, or crop failures were all occasions for royal proclamation of clean slates. By cancelling debt, liberating bondservants, and returning communal properties to temples, rulers like Urukagina prevented the rise of a parasitic creditor class, and made sure that society would not collapse under the burden of debt. Urukagina is never included in the lists of great conquerors or empire builders of history. He ruled a modest city-state for a brief period, and not long after his reign, Sargon of Akkad swept through southern Mesopotamia and brought the era of independent Sumerian city-states to an end. However, his reform text remained as one of the most valuable writings from antiquity, a testament to the idea that justice means protecting the debtor from the creditor, the orphans and widows from the wealthy landowners, and the citizenry from the predatory bureaucracy. By cancelling debts, Urukagina saved the city-state of Lagash from collapsing under its internal contradictions. He fed the weak and infirmed, returned bondservants to their families, restored communal properties to temples, and declared that widows and orphans would no longer be subjugated by wealthy predators. With the first ever recorded social reform, Urukagina represented the ancient ideal of kingship. The ruler should guarantee economic balance and social order, maintaining class rule while counteracting the parasitic tendency of the landlord and creditor class. The contrast between Bronze Age economic principles and our modern-day practice could hardly be starker. Inherited from Roman law, where debt obligations were sacrosanct, modern legal principles have always supported the claims of creditors against the economic solvency of debtors. When financial crises come, governments bail out banks and bondholders instead of writing down debts to a level that the economy can manage. After the 2008 financial crash, the world's top financial institutions were rescued, while regular households were left to drown in mortgage debt. Since then, the world economy has continued to be weighed down by debt that cannot be repaid. Successful economies from Sumer to Babylon recognized for millennia that the burden of debt would always exceed the debtor's ability to pay. This is simply a mathematical certainty. Interest-bearing debt grows exponentially, while production can never maintain exponential growth. It always tapers off. Insisting all debts must be repaid would eventually lead to foreclosures, economic polarization, and the impoverishment of the general population. Ancient rulers understood this, so they employed periodic clean slates to restore social balance, preserve military strength, and limit the power of creditors to appropriate land and labor from their debtors. The modern world, on the other hand, lets creditors win every political battle and lets debtors bear all the burden. In ancient Mesopotamia, creditors sought to foreclose on land and appropriate the social labor reserved for corvée and military service. Their parasitic nature was suppressed by periodic debt cancellations. However, rentier parasitism became a basic economic feature of the modern world. During the 16th to 18th century, English commons were privatized via political insider dealings in the enclosure movement. Today, the World Bank facilitates a modern enclosure movement through the promotion of land privatization in developing countries. This enabled land rights to be pledged as collateral for mortgages and ultimately to be foreclosed on. As The Economist put it, there are two sides to collateral. Enforcing the bank's right to repossess an asset is equally important as recognizing the owner's right to possess it. Our modern world, which holds trillions of dollars in debt, has much to learn from ancient economic principles. The lesson of Urukagina's reform and the tradition of debt amnesty is that a civilization which sacrifices its citizens to the arithmetic of compound interest is not long for this world. While a society that writes off people's unpayable debts may preserve the economic balance that prosperity rests upon. Thank you for watching. I would really appreciate it if you could give me a like or subscribe to my channel. Have a good day. I will see you next time.